Good evening, everybody. Today we are going to continue studying the book of Judges. We looked at Judges chapter 1 and chapter 2 a little bit last week, I believe. And so I want us to go back to Judges chapter 2, and our discussion this evening will center on the idea of a generation that does not know the Lord. So if you would like to turn to Judges chapter 2, we're going to read verses 6 through 14. Judges chapter 2, verses 6 through 14. It says, When Joshua dismissed the people of Israel, or the people of Israel rather, went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years, and they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gash. And all the generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals, and they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to the plunderers, who plundered them, and he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. And whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. Then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods, and bowed down to them. And they soon turned aside from the way of which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Alright, we actually read one extra verse there rather than just stopping at verse 16, but I felt that it was the within the context there. So we are going to look at this idea of the generations. It seems like there have always been a divide, in our culture anyway, between generations. And right now, obviously, the divide between the ages or the generations is age, but in our culture right now, it is more than age. Sadly, and we've seen this from generation to generation, but we do know that oftentimes members of the younger generation will show disrespect for the older generation, the older groups. But at the same time, the older generation is not guiltless in this problem either, because oftentimes members of the older generations will treat the younger group with contempt. Both attitudes, the younger to the older with disrespect and the older to the younger with contempt, are sinful, unbiblical, and certainly they should be considered very unacceptable by all people. The older generation must accept responsibility of teaching the younger. For one thing, it's commanded in the Bible that this is what we are to do. Moses, through God, was very concerned about teaching children. If you turn in your Bibles with me to Numbers chapter 4, we're going to read a few passages. Deuteronomy rather. Deuteronomy chapter 4, and we're going to look at verse 9, and then we're going to look at a couple of other passages, or at least one other passage, because the next two say the same thing pretty much verbatim. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 9. In this passage, Moses says this. He says, "Only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life." Now here's what I want you to concern yourself with the most for this lesson. Make them known to your children and your children's children. Notice there he says, make them known to your children and who? And your children's children. There are times that we will have multiple generations. Not just, we typically think of the children, then their parents and their grandparents. That's the typical way things go. But obviously there are times that we have great grandparents, and even a couple times great. And I have actually known of one person that has been a great grand parent before they passed away. But typically we have just the three, maybe the four is pretty common in our time period with our longevity right now. But notice he says, don't just teach your children, it's your responsibility to also teach your grandchildren. And so that that becomes more of a challenge probably to a lot of folks, because we should be able to relate pretty well to our children, but it gets a little bit more difficult to relate to our grandchildren, especially if we don't get to see them very often. And obviously this is not a, we don't have the same family setup that the ancients did. We're pretty isolated from one another, and a large portion of our culture don't even, a large portion of our culture doesn't even spend a lot of time with their immediate family, let alone their grandparents. And that was not the way it was back then. So we obviously have to adjust. But in situations where we do have children and grandparents being around one another, the grandparents are supposed to help teach the children about God and continue to teach their own children. Just because they've been raised doesn't mean there's not things that they can't learn from you, even though they may be grown. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 7, and this actually is really the same thing that's said over in Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 19. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 7. Here in this passage, Moses commands the people, you shall teach them diligently, that is the commandments that God had given them, to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So that first verse talks about how they are supposed to teach their children diligently. So it is commanded that we teach the children, the younger generation, about God. It's also commended by Jesus. So it's commanded and it's commended. It's commended because in Matthew chapter 19 verse 14, people were bringing their children to see Jesus, and the disciples were distraught at this. They rebuked the parents for doing so, and you know what Jesus does? He commends the parents for doing so by saying, suffer, or let, is how we would say it in our vernacular today, let the little children come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven. And he takes them up in his arms, and he holds them, and he teaches a lesson. So commanded and commended that we bring the younger generation to Jesus. Now there are excuses, there are objections that sometimes people will put up. Sometimes they might say, but the younger generation just doesn't listen. And I want you to think about it. If you're listening and you're one of the older generations, not the teenagers or younger, but think about this. Were we any different when we were younger? Maybe some of us were, but were we any different when we were younger? Did the older generations not say the same thing about us? If you're my age, I'm 42, so did they not say the same thing about us in the 80s, in the 90s, and even in the early 2000s? Very likely they did. In fact, I remember them saying the same thing about us then. I remember going, when I first started working in the ministry back in my early 20s, and going to visit people, older people, and talking about how it was, how they couldn't imagine even raising a teenager, and that was in 1996. So that's just the way things have been. there's that challenge to bridge that generation gap. And the burden is not on the younger generation. The burden goes to those who are supposed to be mature and wise to try to figure it out. Listen, they may not listen. They may not. But that's not really a generational thing. I know a lot of old people that don't listen. I know a lot of people my age that don't listen. I know a lot of teenagers don't listen, but eventually a lot of those will. And a lot of them do right now. You'd be surprised the things that they're picking up. Isaiah faced a similar situation, not with teenagers so much, but with the nation of Israel. In Isaiah chapter 6, right after Isaiah sees that frightening vision of the Lord in the temple, and he realizes that he is a man of unclean lips, and he dwells among a people of unclean lips. And then you have the seraph coming over to him and cleansing him with hot coal on his lips. And then he sees the Lord. He says, "Who will go for us? Who will go to the people?" And Isaiah says, "Here am I," or "Here I am, send me." That's in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 8. And God says to him in verse 9, "Go and say to the people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull, and their eyes heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and they hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed." Now here's the problem that Isaiah foresees. He says, "Then I said, How long, O Lord?" And he said, meaning God, "Until cities lie waste, without inhabitant, and houses without people. And the land is a desolate waste, and the Lord removes people far away. And the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. And though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump." So in other words, God's telling Isaiah, you keep teaching, you keep preaching, keep proclaiming, even though they're not going to listen. And you just keep on doing it, even though their cities will lie waste and their houses will be uninhabited. Another objection people say is, well, I can't relate to them. There's just so many years in between, and they're into this and I'm into that, and I understand that. Things do change, and we do live in a time period, unlike most other time periods, where things have changed very rapidly. If you think about it, think about what was going on 100 years ago in 1920. What was going on in 1920? We just finished the First World War, so it hasn't been too long since the Wright brothers had discovered how to keep a machine in the air. Think about what had happened just a few years prior to that. We were still riding in horses and buggies. There were cars, there were cameras, but they were few and far between, and they were mainly just toys for rich people, and they weren't in very good shape. Since then, think of the things that we have been able to do. We have gone to the moon, and the last few years we've actually sent a space probe past anywhere we've ever sent anything built by humans before, as far as we know. We've split the atom. We have, and on a simpler level, we have the television, we have internet, we have video games. Yeah, things are completely different. Things change, and they're changing rapidly all the time. So there's a challenge there to try to relate to folks. But once again, that's not a good excuse. The burden is not on the younger generation. The burden is on us. Figure out ways to relate to them, and realize that all of us are human. Whether you're older, whether you're younger, we're all human, and so therefore that means that we have the basic similarities, basic same needs. We all want to be treated with respect. We all want to teach, or to be taught, and to have friends and feel needed and loved. That's cross-generational. That's cross-cultural, and so we look for ways that we are able to relate to people, whether that be someone that is much younger than us, or someone that's in a different culture. Paul had this problem in the book of Acts, but he didn't see it as a problem. You see, there would be times that Paul would start teaching Jewish people about Jesus, and he would have a certain method of teaching them about Jesus, and then he would teach Gentiles about God and Jesus, but he would have a different method for them. And the reason was because the Jewish folks were at a different place on their spiritual walk of faith than the Gentiles were. A lot of the Gentiles had begun, most of them had not, so he had to figure a way that he could relate to them, to see what he had in common, and he would start from there and move forward and bring them to Jesus. We must be wise enough to do the same thing, and that dictates not just wisdom, but dictates the idea that I feel that person, that my grandchild, that my child, or someone else is worth the effort to teach them about God. Some would also say, well, the school system should teach children, or we're not even going to talk about that. That's not the school's job to teach children about God, or how to become a decent human being. That's the parents' job. That's the family's job. Some might even say the church should do it. On a normal, when it's not the pandemic, we have Sunday school, we have Sunday worship, we have Sunday evening worship, but of course then we don't have a lot of folks that come to that. We have Wednesday evening Bible study. Again, not as many come. So the average person, when it's not the pandemic, spends maybe an hour worshiping God. That is nowhere near enough time to teach people, to teach your children, your grandchildren, about the importance of God. But it's only an hour a week, and if you're not doing things at home with them and telling them about what God has done and what Jesus has done, and showing them the way, it becomes more of a, well, this is just something we do as a side, and it's not the it's not the priority. This stuff right here, I'm not just saying this because this is my livelihood. This is what is the most important. Getting people ready, teaching them about God so that they can in turn do the will of the Father on earth and have hope of eternal life. This has got to be the top priority, the most important thing that we do. It's up not to the church to get this done. It's up to the families to get it done. Bring them to church. That's got to be part of it. But you've also got to be teaching them about God in your daily conversations, as Moses said there in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 7. Another objection might be, well, I just simply don't know enough. That's not a good excuse. You have the ability to learn. You don't have to know everything. None of us do. You may not know as much as someone else. You may know more. But if you are a Christian, you have to know something. You couldn't have just become a Christian by accident. You weren't born into it. You were reborn into it, and that comes with a specific set of knowledge that you had to pick up from someone else. So you know what you had to do. That's a perfect place to start. Study together with them. That'd be something that you try to keep on doing that. It may not be easy. Not all children want to do that. Start them out off young, and if they're older now, just keep working on them. You probably have to use a different method of getting into their mind and their heart. Some people say I'm too tired, or I'm too busy. Absolutely understand that, but that's not going to be an excuse when we're going to hate ourselves for that excuse if they lose their souls, simply because I was too tired or too busy to talk to them about what was really important. And then, of course, some people will say, well, I just don't want to prejudice my kids. I want them to make their decision. That is the absolute silliest thing that you could say. I said silly because I didn't want to say anything too mean. When you have your children, it's your responsibility to teach them. They're going to be taught. They're going to be taught things, and if you don't teach them about God, the world's not going to teach them about God. You know, if you tell your children, you take your children out and you look at the stars, and the stars look really small from our perspective. But if you teach them that, hey, you know what? Those stars up there, if we were closer to them, they would be so much bigger than the planet Earth. And you know what? You could even say, there's a lot of people talking about this now. I can't believe this, but a lot of people talk about this. The Earth is round. It only looks flat from this level because of our perspective, but it's actually round. I mean, you're expected to teach kids things like that. No one's going to accuse you of prejudicing them because of their cosmology, or prejudicing them of your cosmology. Those are facts. Those are things that they should know. There are things about God that they should know. And if a person is insecure in their faith, then I suppose that they would prejudice their children and tell them, you need to believe because this is what I believe. But if you are secure in your faith and you know why you believe, and you teach them why you believe that, and kids will have, they're still going to make their own decision, but at least it's going to come from a more honest and open place than just a demand or a command to do this because this is what I do. Show them by example, teach them with truth and honesty. We need to do this because it is our duty to both God and to them. And not only that, but it's our duty to our nation. That's right, it's our duty to our nation. Look at the nation around us. There's a lot. There's that Facebook meme that goes around that says something like, "You've never been chased by an angry rooster, and it shows," or "You've never been told to go out and get a, get I can't remember what they call it. My mom didn't do this to us. A switch. There it is, a switch from the tree." I've had friends tell me that their mom or their grandma used to tell them to go pick out a switch from the tree so they could get whipped for doing something wrong, and if they didn't bring back a good one that was good enough, they'd have to go back, get another one, then they'd get a double. So I've seen that on Facebook. You've never had to choose your own switch from a tree, and it shows. There's a lot of people right now that could be said, and this is not a judgment, this is just facts. There's a lot of people who were not taught about Jesus in our nation, and it shows. You see, it's not just about getting to heaven. Heaven is the icing on the cake. Eternal life is the icing on the cake. It's about bringing the will of God to earth now. It's about being a good, Christ-like, godly person in the here and now, and leading others to Jesus by glorifying God by our actions and by our words. It's our duty to the human race that we teach people about God, especially the younger generation, because eventually we're going to be gone. And if we don't continue this, teaching them, people will forget. And we'll see what we're seeing now, only worse. And we'll see what Israel saw in Judges 2 when they forgot the Lord and they began serving the Baals and the Ashtaroth. And that includes human sacrifice, children sacrifice. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen here, though we do see a type of child sacrifice here in the United States and around the world. But things will be bad. And we've got to make sure that we're doing our part to stop that. We must give our children the most important things in life, and it's not material possessions. We must do this because their eternity and the preceding generation's eternity depend on it. Someone taught you, but someone had taught that person who taught you, and so on and so forth. Generation upon generations, eternity depend upon the previous generations to teach them about the Lord, about what they need to do to be saved. I want to thank everyone for listening this evening. I hope that you are doing well. Pray that this everything here in our world, and specifically our country right now, will calm down. Keep praying for that. Keep praying for God's will to be done. And if there's any time that you need to call and talk, just feel free. Shoot me a message or give me a call on the cell phone. If there's any here that's listening that might need to be a Christian, become a Christian. We encourage you to do that as well. So I hope you'll have a good week, and we will see you soon. God bless.